Today, if a store runs out of eggs, we complain. If butter disappears, we scroll for substitutes. But during World War II, there was no scrolling and no replacements on the shelf. Imports collapsed. Factories shifted to war production. Entire countries faced years without sugar, oil, or flour. And yet, families kept eating, not by finding alternatives, but by inventing them. They boiled turnips to replace butter. They whipped chickpea brine into meringue. They turned potato skins into flour and carrots into candy. Every meal was a compromise, not for taste, but survival. These swaps didn't just stretch food, they replaced it. And in many cases, they worked better than what they stood in for. They weren't trendy. They weren't optional. They were the difference between an empty plate and another day alive. Would your kitchen survive on substitutions alone? Subscribe and rediscover the recipes built to outlast war. Number 1. Barley for rice. When rice shipments stopped, no one panicked. They pivoted, because in wartime Europe, rice was a luxury few could afford and even fewer could find. What came instead was barley. Hulled barley, often overlooked before the war, became a core survival grain across Britain, Poland, and occupied France. It was cheap, local, and remarkably filling. Families used it in stews, porridge, and even shaped it into cold patties for later meals. Barley didn't need imported supply chains. It grew in cooler climates and didn't spoil easily. And most importantly, it stretched. A small handful expanded into a dense, calorie-rich meal. Cooks soaked it overnight, boiled it until tender, and reused the water for broth. Its nutty flavor and chewy texture made it ideal for replacing rice in nearly every dish. Barley pudding replaced rice pudding. Stuffed cabbage was filled with barley instead of white rice. Soups were thickened not with flour, but with boiled barley grains. It lacked the softness and speed of rice. But what it offered instead was stamina. It held up longer in storage, digested slower, and provided warmth through long winter nights. Barley didn't pretend to be rice. It became something else entirely. The grain that didn't vanish when borders closed. Even soldiers carried it. German and Soviet field rations often included dried barley groats because they could survive transport, moisture, and rough handling. Its only weakness was time. Barley took longer to cook, needed more water, and required soaking for best results. In cities where fuel was scarce, that was a challenge, but those with fire and patience made it last. It wasn't a trend. It was a replacement born from need, and it fed millions. Would you recognize it in your pantry, or walk right past it? Hit like if this ancient grain deserves a place on modern shelves. Number 2, beet sugar for white sugar. When imported cane sugar became a wartime casualty, sweetness didn't vanish. It was dug from the ground. Across Europe, civilians turned to sugar beets, not the kind for slicing in salads. These were dense, rough, and grown specifically for one purpose: extraction. Families who had never planted a root crop before now cultivated rows of beets behind homes, in schoolyards, and in fields once used for flowers. The process was slow, but effective. Beets were washed, peeled, chopped, and boiled in water until soft. The resulting pulp was squeezed, often through cloth, sometimes by hand. That juice, cloudy and thick, was then simmered for hours. What remained was a dark, sweet syrup that mimicked molasses in texture and cane sugar in taste. It didn't pour easily, it didn't crystallize, but it sweetened tea, flavored bread, and gave mothers a way to keep morale from collapsing along with calories. Children called it earth honey. Adults used it in everything, from cakes and porridges to medicinal syrups for sore throats. Some even bottled it, storing it in cellars beside pickled cabbage and dried peas. Governments encouraged beet sugar production through pamphlets and demonstrations. In Germany and Eastern Europe, Entire campaigns were launched to teach civilians how to process beets at home, but it wasn't without struggle. The boiling process consumed fuel. Beets were heavy, took months to grow, and required space most urban families didn't have. And without proper straining, the syrup spoiled quickly. Still, it worked. And unlike cane sugar, it didn't depend on ships crossing oceans. It was sweetness grown under siege. Today, sugar beets are processed industrially. But once, they were harvested by hand, not for flavor, but for survival. Would you know how to make sugar if the truck stopped arriving? Tap subscribe and recover the skills buried just beneath the surface. Number 3. Potato peel flour. When wheat ran out and white flour became a distant memory, civilians didn't stop baking. They redefined what flour meant. And it started with what most people once threw away: potato peels. In war-torn cities where bread was rationed by the ounce, every crumb mattered. But it wasn't just the bread itself. It was the ingredients, and flour especially, disappeared fast. Families needed a substitute, something starchy, something that didn't spoil, and they found it piled up in their own kitchens. Every peel from boiled, baked, or roasted potatoes was saved, not composted. Peels were dried on stove grates, window sills, or over low fires until they hardened and curled. Once brittle, they were ground down. Some used hand-cranked mills, others smashed them with stones or rolled them under glass bottles. The goal wasn't fineness, it was function. The resulting powder, coarse, dark, and slightly sweet, wasn't perfect, but it could bulk up wheat, it could thicken stew, and it could stretch a single cup of flour into a loaf large enough to share. In Britain, Ministry of Food pamphlets instructed civilians on flour extenders. Potato peel was chief among them. And in Eastern Europe, it was common to find wartime bread made from 40% or more of potato-derived filler. It didn't rise as well. It baked heavier. But it filled stomachs, and that was enough. Some women even blended it with turnip or carrot peel flour when supplies grew tighter. The smell was earthy. The color was gray. But in occupied cities, no one asked how it looked, only if it could be sliced. The flour was also used in pancakes, dumplings, and thick gruel. In some shelters, it was the only ingredient left. There were risks. If peels weren't cleaned properly before drying, dirt and rot entered the mix. If dried too fast, they burned. But for families who had nothing else, every mistake became a lesson in precision. Today, potato peels are trash again, discarded without a second thought. But once they were flour, and they turned waste into the means to survive another week. Would you ever grind what you usually throw away? Number 4. Roasted barley coffee. When coffee vanished from shelves and blackouts shut down imports, millions gave up their morning ritual. But not everyone. Instead of brewing silence, civilians roasted barley. Barley grains, cheap, local, and widely available, became the coffee substitute of occupied Europe. It wasn't about caffeine. It was about warmth, routine, and the comfort of holding something hot in cold hands. The process began with dry barley, often cleaned by hand and roasted in pans until dark brown. The smell, rich and smoky, filled kitchens like a memory of better days. Some crushed the grains with rolling pins. Others used hand grinders passed down from pre-war times. The result wasn't quite coffee. It lacked bitterness in the bite, but it delivered depth, warmth, and a trace of toasted flavor that became enough. Families brewed it the same way they did real coffee, in enamel pots or makeshift kettles. Some mixed it with a pinch of chicory, dandelion root, or dried beet shavings to mimic aroma. A spoonful of beet syrup or dried milk gave it body. Even in prison camps and field hospitals, barley coffee was served. It didn't energize, but it stabilized. In Germany, it was known as Muckafuck. In France, Café d'Orge. In Poland, WWII. Each region made it their own. Its biggest strength wasn't flavor, it was access. Barley could be grown in small plots, stored for years and roasted without machines. A few handfuls could last a week. It became the symbol of making do and moving forward. But there were challenges. Roasting unevenly led to a scorched or grassy taste. Some added ash by mistake, others reused grains too many times, extracting only bitterness. Still, the ritual endured. Because in wartime, coffee wasn't a luxury. It was a small act of control, and barley made it possible. Today, substitutes are mocked. But once, they were the only thing left to brew. Would you give up the ritual, or learn to roast what you already have? What? Number 5. Mashed turnips for butter. When ration books ran out of fat allowances and butter vanished from shops, families didn't stop baking. They turned to root vegetables. Among the most surprising substitutions was mashed turnip, not for taste, but for texture. Turnips were common, rugged, and abundant. They grew in poor soil, survived frost, and yielded heavily even under wartime cultivation pressure. More importantly, they could be boiled, mashed, and mixed into dough to mimic the binding quality of fats. The process was simple but specific. Turnips were peeled, cubed, and boiled until just soft, not waterlogged, then mashed finely and left to cool completely. The resulting mash had to be dry, almost paste-like. Only then could it replace butter in baking. Civilians mixed turnip mash into cakes, scones, and breads. They weren't flaky or golden, but they held together and they fed families without ration points. In Scotland, wartime butterless bannocks became common. Oat cakes bound with root mash and baked on flat stones. In parts of Eastern Europe, mashed turnip was used in dumplings and fritters. Combined with flour and salt, it held everything in place. The substitution didn't bring flavor, it dulled it. But in kitchens where sugar was already gone and eggs were powdered, expectations adjusted fast. Mothers called it ghost fat. It didn't taste like butter, but it made the bread rise, and that was enough. Turnip mash was also used cold, spread lightly on dry bread with salt and herbs. It gave moisture to otherwise empty sandwiches, especially when paired with preserved vegetables or reconstituted meats. There were drawbacks. Too much mash and the dough collapsed. Too wet, and it turned to paste. Recipes had to be adjusted, measured not by cups, but by feel. Still, the result was structure, and in wartime baking, structure mattered more than flavor. What mattered was the ability to hold together under heat, under pressure, under shortage. Today, we chase butter substitutes for health. Once they were hunted for survival. Because when the fridge is empty and the shelves are bare, it's not about richness. It's about what still works. Would you mash roots or wait for butter that may never come? Number 6. Dried carrot sweets. When sugar disappeared and candy became a distant memory, sweetness didn't vanish. It shrank, dried, and came from the ground. Carrots, with their natural sugars, became a wartime solution to a problem no ration book could fix. Children still needed something sweet. Civilians peeled and grated fresh carrots, then pressed them into small discs or bars, sometimes mixed with a drop of beet syrup or dried fruit, but often used alone. These mixtures were laid on cloth or paper and dried slowly on windowsills, stovetops, or under weak sun. The result wasn't soft. It was chewy, dense, and sticky, but it tasted faintly sweet. And for families with nothing else to offer, that was enough. Children chewed them slowly, not for flavor, but for the memory of what flavor used to be. In Britain, pamphlets encouraged vegetable confections. In Germany, carrot-based candy became part of civilian ration supplements. Some mothers rolled the grated carrot into small balls, dusted them with dry milk or flour, and handed them out during holidays. Others packed them into lunch tins wrapped in wax paper. The sweets weren't luxurious. but they gave morale where meals couldn't. And they delivered nutrients at a time when fruit, sugar, and vitamins were scarce. Carrot sweets stored well, too. Once dried, they lasted weeks, longer in dry climates, even longer in cellars. They didn't melt, didn't spoil, and didn't attract pests if stored in jars. But they weren't perfect, too thick, and they rotted during drying. Too thin, and they crumbled before they could be eaten. The balance had to be learned and remembered. Still, they filled a critical role, a moment of normalcy in a world full of absence. Today, we throw carrots into blenders. Once they were dessert, because in war, sweetness doesn't come from luxury, it comes from effort, dried, packed, and made to last. Number 7. Chickpea water. When eggs vanished from kitchens, rationed, expensive, or redirected to troops, civilians had to get creative. One of the most unlikely solutions came not from the egg aisle, but from a cooking pot. Chickpeas were already common. Canned or dried, they offered protein in bulk in meatless meals. But it was the water, the leftover brine from boiling or storing chickpeas, that changed everything. Thick, pale, and slightly slippery, this liquid was saved, chilled, and whipped. To most, it seemed impossible, but with time and a strong whisk, it foamed, rising like beaten egg whites. Mothers used it in cakes, biscuits, and puddings. It held air, it bound batter, it made dew when chickens couldn't. The earliest mentions came quietly, shared in letters, overheard in market queues, or published in underground homemaking newsletters. What seemed like waste became substitution, and what felt like defeat turned into ingenuity. In many homes, the water was poured off, cooled overnight, and whipped in ceramic bowls. No electric mixers, no recipes, just memory and repetition. Results varied. Sometimes it collapsed, sometimes it held. But when it worked, it brought life back to recipes long abandoned. This wasn't widespread at first. It required access to beans and the patience to experiment. But by the end of the war, households from France to Poland had learned the method. It wasn't about flavor, it had none. But it offered structure, the missing piece in war-weary kitchens. Today, chefs call it aquafaba. Back then, it had no name. It was simply survival. Because when eggs are gone and shelves are bare, you don't look for perfection. You look for what holds the cake together. Would you throw away the water or remember what it can become? Number 8. Vinegar and baking soda for yeast. When yeast became scarce or stopped working altogether, bread didn't disappear, it simply rose another way. Civilians found an answer not in the bakery but in chemistry. A spoon of baking soda, a splash of vinegar. Together, they replaced the lift that yeast once gave. This wasn't about perfection. It was about pressure and how to create it. The science was simple. Sodium bicarbonate reacts with acid. The result? Carbon dioxide bubbles. Those bubbles expand dough, not as slowly or evenly as yeast, but fast enough to bake bread when time and supplies ran out. The technique spread across rationed kitchens in Britain, the Soviet Union, and parts of occupied Europe. It became common in emergency loaf recipes, those that skipped fermentation altogether. Families mixed flour with a pinch of salt, added soda, then quickly stirred in warm water with a capful of vinegar or lemon juice. The dough puffed slightly. It baked dense but edible, enough to feed, not impress. Speed was critical. Once vinegar hit the soda, the clock started. Dough had to be shaped and baked within minutes before the gas escaped. There were no long rises, no warm-proofing cupboards, just knead, shape, and into the oven. Or straight onto a hot stone slab. Flavor was mild, texture tight. But in a war zone, that didn't matter. What mattered was that the bread could be sliced. This method became especially vital in shelters, field kitchens, and households that couldn't store yeast for long. It was used for biscuits, soda breads, dumplings, anything that needed rise without time or fermentation. Today, we see it in recipes and call it convenience. Back then, it was adaptation under stress. Because when fermentation fails, survival doesn't. It rises anyway, even if just enough. Would you remember the ratio, or wait for yeast that never returns? Number 9. Bone broth for cooking oil. When cooking oil disappeared from shelves and ration books came up dry, civilians didn't stop frying. They turned to bones, not for meat, but for fat, because when nothing else remained, bone broth became both base and fuel. Every butchered animal was stripped to its skeleton, and every skeleton was boiled. Bones, even the smallest scraps, were simmered for hours. Marrow melted out. Fat floated to the top. Once cooled, that fat hardened, forming a soft white cap over the liquid. Families skimmed it carefully, stored it in jars or tins, and used it exactly as they once used oil, for frying onions, greasing pans, crisping potatoes, and making biscuits that no longer had butter. This wasn't luxury. It was extraction. The broth itself didn't go to waste either. It became soup, rich, dark, filled with trace minerals, a base for lentils, barley, or dry vegetables that had no flavor left on their own. But the fat, that was gold. Bone fat, when cleaned and stored properly, could last days without refrigeration. It wasn't neutral. It smelled of the animal, carried its flavor, and sometimes needed straining through cloth to remove bits of bone or gristle. Still, it worked. In cities like Warsaw and Leningrad, bone broth replaced oil completely for weeks on end. In rural England, families traded bones between households just to scrape another tablespoon of fat. Even marrow spoons, thin, long-handled tools, made a comeback. Nothing was wasted. Not a drop, not a smear. But it came with limits. Bones were hard to come by. Meat was already scarce, and overboiled broth could turn bitter or gelatinous if not watched closely. Yet those who learned the method had one advantage: a hot pan when others had none. Today, we discard bones without thought. Back then, they were a second harvest. Because when oil vanishes, survival doesn't come from a bottle. It rises from what you thought was already used up. Would you skim, store, and fry, or wait for a delivery that never comes? Number 10. Cabbage leaves for bread wraps. When bread disappeared and ovens went cold, sandwiches didn't vanish. They changed shape. Cabbage, once a side dish, became the wrap itself. In bombed-out cities and rural towns alike, civilians used broad cabbage leaves to replace what they could no longer bake. It wasn't convenience, it was necessity, layered in green. Large outer leaves, once tossed aside, were cleaned, blanched, and softened. Their natural curve made them perfect vessels for filling. Potato mash, barley, pickled vegetables, and even cold meat scraps were bundled inside, then wrapped, tied with string, or folded tightly, and eaten by hand, no slicing required. Some families steamed them lightly, stacking them in cloth-lined pots. Others served them cold, folded like pockets. In shelters and field kitchens, cabbage became the only bread that didn't need flour, yeast, or fire. It wasn't neutral. It brought flavor, and sometimes bitterness. But it held together. And when your hands are numb and rations are thin, structure matters more than taste. Cabbage leaves also preserved well. Once blanched and dried, they could be layered in root cellars for days. Some homes smoked or salted them, folding and stacking for future meals. They weren't delicate. They were strong, like the hands that wrapped them. In Eastern Europe, stuffed cabbage, once a festive dish, became daily survival food. In Western Europe, it filled the gap when bread lines failed. Children ate them in classrooms. Workers carried them in cloth bundles. Soldiers received them from home. There were drawbacks. Rot set in fast if leaves weren't dried properly. Too much moisture, and fillings leaked. But every bite still delivered calories and a sense of control. Because in wartime, bread wasn't always flour and heat. Sometimes it was leaves, folded, filled, ready. Today, wraps are branded and packaged. Once, they grew from the soil and replaced what war took away. Would you roll your next meal in something that grows? Or depend on what's shipped? Subscribe and rebuild your menu from the ground up. They didn't have options. They had hunger. And the daily choice between what was available or nothing at all. World War II families didn't find substitutes because they wanted to. They created them because failure wasn't survivable. Tzatziki, when sugar vanished, they boiled beets. When flour ran dry, they crushed peels. And when oil, eggs, and yeast disappeared, they found answers in places modern kitchens wouldn't dare look. This wasn't resourcefulness. It was wartime engineering at the kitchen table, not for taste, not for variety, but for endurance. Every swap in this list wasn't just a trick. It was a test of patience, of precision, of how long something could hold together when everything else was falling apart. Today, we treat substitution as an inconvenience. Back then, it was the only reason food reached the plate. And the deeper lesson remains. If you can't adapt in the kitchen, you won't last long when the system breaks. Because survival doesn't begin with fire or shelter. It begins with knowing what to reach for when the things you depend on are gone. These swaps still work. And those who remember them won't be caught waiting when shelves go bare again. If you've listened this far, you already know why it matters. Subscribe now, not to be entertained, but to rebuild the knowledge that once kept families alive.